Seeking the New Poetry. George Meredith. Once again, we find another poet-writer mentioned numerous times by Sri Aurobindo in his masterpiece on the ranges of poetry above the thought mind, the future poetry. In the first chapter, Mantra, Sri Aurobindo writes about new ways in English literature, a book by Mr. James Cousins that he highly praised. And here we find the first mention of Meredith. Quote, "But still the book deals among contemporary poets with Tagore, A.E., and Yeats. Among recent poets with Stephen Phillips, Meredith, Carpenter. Great names, all of them, not to speak of lesser writers." And then on the next page, Sri Aurobindo writes, "The helpfulness of this suggestive work comes more home to me personally because I have shared to the full the state of mere blank, which is the ordinary condition of the Indian mind with regard to its subject. Such touch as in the intellectual remoteness of India I have been able to keep up with the times had been with contemporary continental rather than contemporary English literature. With the latter, all vital connection came to a dead stop with my departure from England a quarter of a century ago. It had for its last events the discovery of Meredith as a poet in his modern love and the perusal of Christ in Hades some years before its publication, the latter an unforgettable date. On page 173, Sri Aurobindo writes, "The poets of yesterday and today, Whitman, Carpenter, the Irish poets, Tagore, but also others in their degree, are forerunners of this new spirit and way of seeing, prophets sometimes, but at others only illumined by occasional hints or by side rays of a light which has not flooded all their vision. I may take for my purpose 4 of them, whose names stand behind or are still with us, and their station already among those whose work endures: Meredith and Phillips, among recent English poets, A.E. and Yeats of the Irish singers." And on the next page he writes, "One thing that comes home to us when we take a comparative view of this poetry, when we look at the inmost strands of the expression at which it arrives in these 4 poets, all of them among its boldest and most original and therefore most revealing representatives, is a certain common element behind their differences. This we find in a novel use of rhythmic movement, a sudden new moving force, turn, stamp, and fashion in the minting of the gold and silver of their language. And as the secret of this departure, a quite other innate or conscious aim, not always manifest in the visible form of the substance, though that too is there in plenty, but in the way of seeing the object on which the inner eye is turned, whether it be idea, thing, or person, significant emotion, or glint of soul power in man, or revealing object or suggestive hint in nature. This aim we may perhaps best express if we take up and modify a phrase of Meredith's, when he speaks of the hampered human voice that could never say, "Our inmost in the sweetest way," hampered by the austerity of its wisdom or the excess of its sense and passion. But if it is rarely that this sweetest way is found, yet do we not get near to it sometimes in Yeats and Tagore? At least this new turn of the poetic voice is characteristically an endeavor to see and to say our inmost in the inmost way. Meredith's poetry belongs to an earlier technique, observes faithfully the metrical law. But the subtler thing is already coming. Some curious turn is given to the beat, which persistently compels it to serve some dominant soul tone of the thought and seeing, and to dance attendance on that. As in the 4 lines already quoted from The Lark Ascending. Or else there is the turn towards long spaces and lingering tones, where the metrical sound floats and seems always on the point of drowning in some deep sea of inner intonation. And he quotes, "Through widening chambers of surprise to where throbs rapture near an end that eye recedes, because his touch is infinite and lends a yonder to all ends." Sri Aurobindo continues, a description which might well be applied to the whole drift and cause of this spiritual principle of rhythm. But in a more recent work, it is precisely the recovery of this supreme power of speech on that loftier and subtler level, which to one who comes freshly to this poetry breaks out with a sense of satisfying surprise and discovery. It is not complete, it is not everywhere, it is only just rising from the acquired basis of the previous heights of expression to its own realm, but it is there in a comparative abundance, and it is the highest strain of its intensities. We find it in Meredith when he writes of color, the soul's bridegroom. He has got the intimate revealing image of this fuller and higher intuitive manner. Or in his larks, silver chain of sound, of many links without a break. When he writes again, "Nor know they joy of sight, who deem the wave of rapt desire must be its wrecking and last issue of delight. He has got the perfected turn of the direct, intuitive word of thought in its more crowded manner of suggestion. The kinship in the last line to the Shakespearean manner is close, as too its more clear and limpid speech in other turns. He quotes, "The songs seraphically free from taint of personality," and in the lines, "Dead seasons quicken in one petal spot of color unforgot." He has it ready for an intuitive and vivid spiritual interpretation of nature. Meredith, with his greater force of thinking, gives us the clear significance of what is here only a powerful indication, a seeing identity of the soul of man with the hidden soul in earth nature. "I neighbor the invisible so close that my consent is only asked for spirits masked to leap from trees and flowers. And this because with them I dwell in thought, while calmly bent to read the lines dear earth designs, shall speak her life on ours." And the same turn emerges too in direct thought on the large aspects of life, as in such a phrase as, "Lonely antagonist of destiny," or that which describes the listless ripple of oblivion. Lines which give us, by some deep suggestion to the spiritual sight, a whole abiding soul aspect of man and the universe in a single revealing expression. The effort of poetry of this kind of inspiration may be defined by adapting another expression of Meredith's. To spell the letters of the sky and read a reflex upon earth, else meaningless. And the fullness of that which it points to beyond itself is a movement to unite the life of the earth, not lessened, not denied, not cast away, but accepted, with its own hidden spiritual reality, the one crucial movement necessary for man before he can reach that perfection which the race shall have on its heights when, and he quotes, "the vile plucked out of them, the unlovely slain, nor forfeiting the beast with which they are crossed, to stature of the gods they shall attain. They shall uplift their earth to meet her Lord, themselves the attuning chord." This is in substance the same strain that arises finally from the more puissant voice of Whitman. But it has, if a less forceful, a profounder touch, a more delicate, intimate, and spiritual closeness of seeing, experience, and utterance is its charm and distinction. The poets of the middle 19th century in England and America philosophized, moralized, or criticized life in energetic and telling or beautiful and attractive or competent and cultured verse. But they did not represent life with success or interpret it with high poetic power or inspired insight. And they were not stirred and uplifted by any deeply great vision of truth. The reasoning and observing intellect is a most necessary and serviceable instrument, but an excess of reason and intellectuality does not create an atmosphere favorable to moved vision and the uplifting breath of life. And for all its great stir of progress and discovery, that age, the carnival of industry and science, gives us, who are in search of more living, inner and potent things, the impression of a brazen flavor, a heavy air, an inhibition of the greater creative movements, a level spirit of utility and prose. The few poets who strained towards a nearer hold upon life had to struggle against this atmosphere, which weighed upon their mind and clogged their breath. Whitman, striving by stress of thought towards a greater truth of the soul and life, found refuge in a revolutionary breaking out into new anarchic forms, a vindication of freedom of movement, which unfortunately, at its ordinary levels, brings us nearer to the earth and not higher up towards a more illumined air. Swinburne, excited by the lyric fire within him, had too often to lash himself into a strained violence of passion in order to make a way through the clogging thickness for its rush of sound. Meredith's strains, hymning life in a word burdened and packed with thought, are strong and intimate, but difficult and few. Here then, the last mention of Meredith in the future poetry. Quote, "The all-informing spirit, when found in all its fullness, heals the scission between thought and life. The need of a just balance between them disappears. Instead, there begins a new and luminous and joyful fusion and oneness. The Spirit gives us not only a greater light of truth and vision, but the breath of a greater living. For the Spirit is not only the self of our consciousness and knowledge, but the great self of life. To find ourself and the self of things is not to go through a rarefied ether of thought into nirvana, but to discover the whole greatest integral power of our complete existence. This need is the sufficient reason for attaching the greatest importance to those poets in whom there is the double seeking of this twofold power, the truth and reality of the eternal self and spirit in man and things, and the insistence on life. All the most significant and vital work in recent poetry has borne this stamp. The rest is of the hour, but this is of the future. It is the highest note of Whitman. In him, as in one who seeks and sees much, but has not fully found, it widens the sweep of a great pioneer poetry, but is an opening of a new view, rather than a living in its accomplished fullness. It is constantly repeated from the earth side in Meredith, comes down from the spiritual side in all A.E.'s work, moves between earth and the life of the worlds behind in Yeats' subtle, rhythmic voices of vision and beauty, echoes with a large fullness in Carpenter.